Welcome back, everybody, to your, well, not really daily update and whatnot, but we're back with, well, I'm back. I'm sort of healthy again, my cold is over, my fever is gone, my voice is more or less back. We'll see how long it will actually last today. That's sort of the test, and yeah, I'm back. I'm glad I'm back, and I want to talk about the rest of Blood and Bone with you, which I'll do today and tomorrow, and I'll try to get everything from chapters 11, 12, and 13 today. We'll see if that works. I'll not say too much on chapter 11 though, because I want to do something else about that video, that particular chapter in the near future as a separate video. We'll see how that goes. Anyway, I'm glad I'm back. I'll maybe still do something on the festival stuff if you're interested. Otherwise, yeah, let's get to this, shall we? Cheers. Gods, I've missed this. All right, so here we are. We're nearing the end of Blood and Bone, and there's a lot going on right now. So let's look at all of that and see how far we can actually get with it. Yeah. Chapter 11 is an interesting one. It has it kind of stands out. It sticks out compared to some of the other all of the other chapters, since it covers one specific event and only through one viewpoint character. And that is the attack on the city, the capital of the Thamaturgs. We see all of that, obviously, like before, through the eyes of, what's his name, Prince Jatal. And yeah, there's a bunch of interesting things that I want to point out here today, and then we'll do a separate video about this battle and why I think it's a very interesting chapter as a whole. So what do we learn here? We see the usual stuff, how the group of the Adwami is very much hyped to go into that battle. We see that through the eyes of a skeptical person, in this case Prince Jadal, but the whole battle thing goes off, and there's a few things that we can learn there. One of them is obviously that feeling of invincibility that can come with a previous victory, that can, shift like loyalties and trust in a lot of ways. And Jatal kind of notices that, because after that first victory, everyone is basically trusting the war leader, who, we kind of know who he is right now. Everyone is trusting him. They do what he tells them, and there's like no longer the whole like feuding and whatnot, backstabbing that was there in the beginning. And he feels kind of left behind at this point. He still does it though, and this is sort of like the other side of that we can see here is obviously how jealousy and self-pity can make for a deadly combination, and that's sort of what we also learn in this chapter in general. And yeah, it's frustrating to read that, but on the other hand, I guess a lot of us have been through that at one point in our lives, where we made a lot of dumb mistakes because we were jealous and felt bad for ourselves at the same time. It's usually called being 15, or 16. But that's sort of where the whole thing starts. So yeah, there's that. And then we have some interesting observations on society. That is when they charge into the city. The idea that like all of Thaumaturg land is basically agrarian, except for the Thaumaturg class, and how that is probably by design to keep everyone under control. And now we can look back in our world's history and find a bunch of societies that work that way, where basically everyone is a peasant, maybe even owned by their lords, but like how, and this is that's the important aspect here, and that's something that we've learned a lot in our general history as well, is like agrarian agriculture takes a lot of time and effort. It's not exactly, at least basic medieval or like pre-medieval agriculture takes a shitload of time. It's time and energy intensive work. It's like you have to go out there every fucking day. You have to do whatever you need to do with your fields, plowing, sowing, weeding, all of that stuff. If you don't, and over time, you spend a lot of time there, which is incidentally why there is like very little like gender role division in agricultural, like agrarian cultures up to a point, even though other people claim different. But like if you're a poor farmer, everyone has to work on that fucking farm, on those fields, and no one cares whether you're a man hunting and bringing home those mammoths or a woman tending the fire. That's not how that works. Though the idea that like medieval societies were way more like gender segregated is only true to a point, and that is more like higher classes of society where you can actually afford that kind of shit. Everyone else just had to scrabble no matter what. All right, so just a quick aside. And the other part of that is obviously that, since that takes so much time, it is fairly difficult to actually develop all kinds of cultural techniques and whatnot, gather wealth, and through that wealth, status, power, and whatnot, which you get with all kinds of classes in society between the poor fuckers at the bottom and the rich guys on top. And you see that in European history, for example, with the rise of the towns, the rise of different crafts and arts and whatnot, so that the burgher class, basically, the bourgeoisie and whatever you want to call it, gains power through wealth and through specialization that is just possible through an abundance of wealth that was gained by the rise of agricultural techniques. I'm very much like simplifying stuff here, right? So don't come after me for like getting history wrong, but that's sort of how the broad thing is. We suddenly have more food than we need. We can sell that shit, so we have a bit more time to actually sit down and think and so forth. Incidentally, what helped with having more food was also like a lot of us dying in the 14th century through what you might call the Black Death, or like just like the plague, whatever you want to call it, the pestilence. Anyway, so that certainly also helped, because we have like an explosion of cultural and whatnot stuff after that. Anyway, it also depends on which country you're in, but that's sort of the broad thing there. With a society where the people up top, in this case the Thamaturgs, forcefully restrain the rest of the population to working in agriculture by, for example, their techniques of having just humans. They don't even have like use animals, apparently, apart from like having a few like mutated humans that they like forced into that kind of thing. But apart from that, they don't have that. Keeps that society very, very static. Now, if you're looking into other areas of our world history, there's also societies that work very much like that. You have a few centers of culture, very few. Everyone else is poor and downtrodden because they are more or less by design and force kept from profiteering from any like developments in cultural techniques and whatnot. That is sort of what we see here with our buddies, the Thamaturgs. Jatal, successful horse warrior and raider, realizes that, which I guess makes him a pretty good scholar. Maybe not the best horse riding like raider. Who knows? Anyway, that's sort of like what I found interesting there. Next interesting point is once they reach the town, not only the town, but once they reach the inner fortress of the Thaumaturgs, and you have the siege happening there. And while that siege in general is very interesting and detailed, and we learn a lot about like how siegecraft works or doesn't work, and so forth, the interesting bit for me is the conversation or realization that what's his name? Calor, our war leader, whom we are still not calling Calor there, but is treating his mercenaries as disposable, as animals, as objects. And Jatal realizes that, and then, because, he's kind of smart, he's like, well, that's terrible. And then he's like, but man, I'm doing the same thing. And that's exactly the point there with the kind of warfare that you have there happening there, which is a feudal like kind of warfare. You have like war leaders, you have underlings in a loyalty structure that is purely based on like birth and class, societal class. That's exactly what you do. You tend to use the people under you as disposable because you are better than them. You are different from them. They are others from you, not because of skill, but because of birth and your identity. And that's an important thing that we can see there. And yeah, it's something that hasn't, I mean, kinda has changed in some regards. You look at the Malazan armies, the Malazan military, there it's different because it's based on merit mostly. But in our society, around where we are, you have the whole same situation. You have like people that own businesses. When I say businesses, I mean like large companies, right? Treating everyone under them as different because the difference in mindset and class is so different between your Jeff Bezos and your poor fucker working in the warehouse. So you can bend it that way if you want. I'm not saying you should, I'm just saying you could if you want to. Alright, now let's look at what happens in that complex. We get in there and it gets super gruesome and brutal and whatnot. We run through there, and Andani gets killed. Jatal has a bit of a revelation, or maybe not, and so forth. But the interesting aspects here, and I'll go back into that with that other video that I want to make. But the interesting bits that I find interesting here are about the Thamaturgs. Once again, we learn that whole conversation between the Shadowam priests and the Thamaturgs, and the Thamaturgs believing that the governing principle of life is will and the mind, whereas the Shadowam believe it is the body, it's the heart. And you have that whole like heart-mind dichotomy. That it's a classic dualism in that regard, right? That you versus materialism, sort of in that way. And the interesting thing there for me is that the thing we see there when they walk through the Thaumaturg ruins, well, not ruins, but you know what I mean, right? Castle. You see all those modifications the Thaumaturgs make on themselves and everyone else. That, I don't want to call it transhumanism, but it certainly kind of goes in that direction in a way. The idea that we can alter our physical form because what it's actually about is our mind, our identity being, defined by our mind. That's sort of what we can see there, and there may be a commentary on that if you want to, look, if you want to see it that way. I just wanted to point that out. Plus that dichotomy, whether we are mostly defined by our physical life or by our mental life, is definitely something that we'll come back to in a second, which is when the Shadowams have won and everyone gets sacrificed to their experiments. But before that, I wanted to say that, I don't know if you remember that, a couple of years ago, I think it started around 2000, maybe a bit earlier, maybe a bit later, something like that. There started to be a bunch of I don't want to call them medical shows, but those kind of expositions where you had a lot of dead humans, prepared in all kinds of weird ways, when you have just their blood vessels shown or just the muscles. And I know we've done that in medical shows forever and ever and ever, but through those newer ones, the interesting thing was that it was it looked really realistic, and I think it started around 2000-ish, I guess, roughly. And a lot of how the dungeons of the Thaumaturgs are described reminded me very much of that as well. The very the look at the human body as a thing to be manipulated, molded in all kinds of ways, and objectified, turned into like an object, a like inanimate object, but like in general an object. And we see that through all those like experiments that we have there with the zombie horror, with that woman that like has just the muscles remaining and all the skin's taken off while she was still alive, because this is magic and we can do that kind of shit. But and then she gets up and starts killing people. And it just reminded me of that, and I just wanted to point that bit out there, if you see if some of you remember those kind of things. Anyway, so there's that. And we come to the last big debate, which is once again between Jatal and that first Shadowam priest that we meet in chapter 1, or is it chapter 1? I don't know. When the war leader talks to the Adwami for the first time. And why is that interesting? Because it shows something that Cam Esslemont does a lot more than Stephen Erickson, and it's something that I personally appreciate. It's something that reminds me of classic science fiction more than classic fantasy, and that is like having like sort of philosophical debates, almost in your like Platonic dialogue style of how do they argue stuff, and that is when they once again argue about the superiority of the body over the mind. And the Shadowam believing in the absolute superiority of the body. This is an interesting thing, because that is basically what you have when we talk about materialism in philosophy nowadays. And the question is, like, is there a soul? And there's people, no, it's all just like brain pop properties. We have no free will. It's all just our brains. And the point then is, if you espouse that specific philosophical worldview, I tend to be a bit skeptical about that one. There's like all kinds of ways beyond that. I don't want to turn this into like a full-on philosophy debate today. But if you espouse full materialism, you don't need to talk about morals anymore when you talk ethics, because there are no, like, because this is all predestined. It's all like, not predestined, but because we don't have free will. This is all just made machines running, like the Shadowrun belief. So concepts of good and evil are ideally just concepts we have made up and have no basis in reality. Now, is the question obviously would be: do we need to have something like absolute good and absolute evil to hang our like ethics and our morality on, or not? That's a different question, though. The danger, however, is there that if you say it's arbitrary and made up, why should we ever follow those things? And couldn't we just all go and do whatever the fuck we want, because there is no such thing as good and evil, and we'd all dance and scream in a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom, to quote a well-known racist. Anyway, but that's sort of like the idea where this goes, and you have that idea that if there is just the flesh and there is no like soul, no personality, no mind behind it, that is not also just a function of the flesh. If you have that situation, then morality becomes a bit of a problem. So that's a discussion that we have there, and then we have the big confrontation with Jatal and Kalor, and Jatal gets his final revelation that Andaniai obviously did not treat him like shit because he fell in love with big old Kalor. No, it was because she suspected something, because she's a bit smarter than our boy Jatal. And that brings us to Jatal's realization that I just glossed over. That happened before, when she dies in his arms and all that. And he's like, she was ambitious and all of that. And she acted like a man would act. And that's why he judged her. And this is obviously something that everyone and their dog, as long as they're pop feminists or feminists or whatever, have like realized by now, which is that in a patriarchal society, we tend to, with like strict gender roles, we tend to get kind of scared as dudes when people of other genders behave like us, or show the same behavior patterns that are praised or are seen as particularly masculine, because it's an attack on our like masculine identity, or like our masculinity. If suddenly everyone can be ruthless and an asshole, it's like, yeah, well, you know what? Maybe everyone can. We could just see Jatal realizing that is like what made him like doubt her, or uncomfortable around her or fear her in a way. And we can see that, like, when you look back at her, like, he's fascinated by her, he's in love with her, because she's also probably physically attractive and all of that, but he's also always scared by her ambition, by her, probably also brilliance and intelligence and all of these other things. And now he finally realized that that's because he was basically putting her in a different role, a different gender role that does not actually exist as such. So fuck him for being a chauvinist. Also, well, fuck him for being an idiot. But as I said, 16-year-old kids be 16-year-old kids, and we were all probably idiots when we were 15 or 16. Well, some of us still are, like, I don't know, me and one. So yeah, anyway, we have that whole situation there, and then he gets kicked out because Calor is nothing if not callous, right? So he's like, I'm pissed off now, so I'll tell you all of that, so you can suffer from, like, realizing all your mistakes, and then you don't get to die. Which, knowing that this is Calor, we kind of see something interesting here, and that is perpetuation of suffering, right? And that's something that we have seen in the Malazan world in a lot of ways, with children perpetuating the errors and mistakes of their parents, and so forth. It's something that we have in our worlds. Like, we tend to kind of spread the misery. We tend to, as people, do, like, do the same kind of things we suffered from to other people, inflict them on other people. Now, obviously not always, not in every detail, but it is a pattern of behavior that has been around for a long time. And it's sort of the one that you have with your typical, like, boomer thing, like, we worked hard for our stuff, and them kids today don't do that anymore. So fuck them. It's like, no, fuck you. It's like, just because you had it hard doesn't mean everyone else does also have to have it hard. I have compassion with your past and your suffering. That doesn't mean I have to also suffer to validate my life or my existence. But Calor is not that kind of person. Calor is like, I feel like shit, and I'm an undying suffering bastard, so I'll let you live and let you suffer too. He turns other people into copies of himself, which is sort of at the root of that whole, like, spreading our own suffering to other people. So don't do that. Don't be like Calor in that regard. He has his good sides, but they are long, long buried. And that's where we're going next. But we see it kind of worked out because Skaza and him and Jatal decide to go on for, like, a big revenge quest against Calor. Like, that's ever gonna work, right? Anyway, that's sort of what we see, and that's the end of chapter 11. And let's talk about other stuff in chapters 12 and 13 and see how much of it I actually remember, because there's a lot goes on, and I had like 2 pages of notes that I can't read now, so there's that. So let's look at those kind of things. Well, we obviously have everyone's favorite sword whipper. I have no whipper. I have no idea. We have everyone's favorite sword dancer, Shimmer, and the others finally arrive in Jakal Viran, and it is a shithole. It actually is just jungle with a few, very, very few ruins, and a very, very few people actually, humans grubbing around there, and the rest is just, jungle. And I don't want to look too deeply into that right now, but what I found interesting is the scene with, like, the golden streets, which seems to be a water reservoir that got touched by the sun, and this whole thing shone golden. And maybe everyone going crazy through the jungle and arriving there already fevered and insane, seeing that, might babble about streets made out of gold later on. And this is something that has happened in our real world as well, that people completely misunderstood stuff and then change it again, like, more to make up stuff later on, that kind of thing. So yeah, there's that, and isn't that fun? The other thing that I wanted to look at is obviously the whole pun lore situation in this earlier one. So I'm kind of jumping around here because I'm I'm not good at concentrating and stuff. Point is, we're talking about Ponlor, still trying to follow Xian and her brother Hanu, and he is fully convinced that he has to find her and convince her of her folly, to take her back and give her into the warm guidance of well-meaning men. And the point there is men. It's male arrogance that he's showing there. The idea of like, and this is exactly that problem, right? So like for some reason in a lot of societies, the male is like, you have your whole stupid like men are from Mars and women from Venus and whatnot bullshit. And the point is the idea that masculinity is for whatever reason connected to rationality and rational thought, which is bullshit, right? I'm not a very rational person, but I'm a man. Point is, dudes are at least as irrational as everyone else, probably more so, if there is such a thing. But the point is, you can't connect rationality or whatever to gender. That doesn't work. Anyway, my point here is that with the Thamaturgs' insistence on rationality and the superiority and supremacy of the mind over the body and whatnot, you have exactly that tendency to split between mind and body. Gender often comes, at least when you're still like in a society where you're talking about two genders, you have that whole idea of like men are rational, women are more like connected to the heart and emotional. It's terrible bullshit, and our good friends the Thamaturgs fall into that trap. At least Ponlor does, and yeah, doesn't really work. But we'll see where this whole thing will take him. It's just interesting to see that in his thoughts, because we get his thoughts in that situation. He then has like his encounter with the same monkey-like creature whose name I always keep forgetting, something copy, that guy, asking him the important question, what is Himatan? And that is, I think, a more subtle question than anything else. It's not just a bit of jungle. It is maybe a retreat, a refugium. Oh, God, a refugium for all kinds of beings, for the other, and so forth. And thus could also be connected to our more like animal side, our more like animalistic side, our more like a lack of control, a bit of a wilder side and whatnot. It thus is a multifaceted thing and not just a bit of jungle. So having that question asked and having Ponlor think about it is an interesting point to go to. So there's that bit. So what else do we learn here? Good question. I don't want to go too deeply into that though. Well, we come close to that one danger that we've like alluded to before, and that is what's actually going on with that damn stranger in the sky, and what happened before, and what will happen again, or will not happen again, and how to deal with that. And we see that through, once again, like different people piecing it together in different situations, and finally Ponlor also realized it, like the idea that in the olden days, the Thamaturgs called down the stranger, who is the crippled god, basically to nuke Calor, which maybe worked, but it didn't work really well. And now that Calor's returning, they may just try it again, because look, there's a green stranger in the sky. Isn't that fun? So we have different people realizing that, trying to figure it out, trying to do stuff about it. Ziana's has obviously figured it out through those dreams that she had and through that fever dreams and whatnot. Ponlor is figuring it out now and decides that he has to actually find her to warn her and tell her that she's right. When he has that weird like encounter with the huge statues that say Calor has returned, which may or may not actually have happened. Who knows? But once again, we don't want to get too deeply into the weeds here today, I think. So let's have us a look at a few other things that happen in the rest of those 2 chapters and see what we can learn from those. One of them is what's going on with our crew. I mean, yeah, there's more fun absurdity with Master Golan and the army, but I mean we've spoken about that before, so yeah, it is still very much pointing out the absurdism of war, of feelings of superiority and whatnot. And it's fun to read. I really enjoy those bits, especially his conversations with the scribe. But yeah, we've spoken about that, so yeah, it's still there. What is kind of new is the facets that we have with the Crimson Guard. Not the Crimson Guard, but the Disavowed. The Disavowed with through Mara there, and the whole situation with Skinner, talking to everyone, the battle. There was a few interesting things there, and the main interesting bit that I found fascinating is that idea, like, how beautiful Himatan, or like, yeah, mostly Himatan as a country actually is, but you need to get rid of all the inhabitants. Now, does that sound familiar or not? Plus the idea, like, a campaign of neglect, willful neglect and disenfranchisement will take care of that. Now, does that sound familiar? I bet it does. So having that whole idea is, once again, how Blood and Bone in general deals with ideas of colonialism, of imperialism, and all the shit we did there. By we, I mean, obviously, people from the global West, I guess. I found that interesting. Another thing that we see there, that we see in the confrontation with Rutana and Skinner is, what a fucking monster. Plus, and this is another theme that we see in the whole book, the idea of invincibility, or the illusion of invincibility. That's a really interesting one, because we have a lot of people in this book that feel invincible, and all of them are brought low. Now, obviously, that's a theme from classic tragedy, the idea of hubris and the downfall. But it's just like explored in different ways, and I feel it's important to do that, because we see that, you know, there's like well, is there hubris in Skinner? Possibly. So far, he's still pretty much alive, though. Same goes for Spite. But we also have that hubris with the Thamaturgs, and they are brought low already. We also have it, apparently, with Rutana and some of Ardata's creatures, which I feel is important, because while, you know, the colonizers, the oppressors are always, you know, it's easy to connect them with that. It's like you go and do your, like, oh, look at the Soviets in Afghanistan, look at the Americans in Afghanistan. I know that's a wild joke, but it's like we tend to connect the failure of colonialism with hubris, and that's fine because it's true. But that doesn't mean that on the other side there's the whole same thing doesn't apply, because even though Rutana, for example, is not actually a human, there is still, you know, human psychology going on. That those are human traits in general. And you see that no matter where. And power and success will make you overconfident. And sooner or later, that will fuck you up. And we'll see, we see that happening here with Rutana and Skinner just killing here. Now, the question is, are there exceptions to that rule in the Malazan world or in our world? Well, yes, maybe. I mean, obviously, Karsa Orlong, but maybe Skinner. And I guess we're still rooting, or like still waiting to find out what's going on with Skinner there. But yeah, I guess we'll leave him for now with his group, going on another quest to find another piece of the crippled god. My point, however, was more about the idea of those thoughts of Mara, of like how to get rid of the inhabitants to actually take the land, because it's actually quite valuable and maybe beautiful, although beauty in her eyes is probably more about usefulness. And that's very much like how we treat it, like large parts of Africa, Asia, and the Americas when we came there as European, arseholes mostly. It's like you look at the country, like, isn't it beautiful? By beautiful you mean economically exploitable. And then you realize there's people there that might actually, like the place the way it is right now. Going from there to more like of that cultural arrogance for a bit. Let's talk about Sour and Merc and what happens there. Now, obviously, Sour has realized how to learn from the land, is fascinated by it, and Merc doesn't deal well with it. And there's an interesting scene there, Merc is pissed off by it and thinks he's crazy. He's basically a traitor to civilization, culture, and whatnot. And how could those savages know anything, and so forth. But he then realizes where that comes from and actually tries to make up. He's still struggling, but the whole process, I think, is interesting because it shows that even that someone like Merc, or basically each and every one of us, have it in ourselves to examine our prejudices and our ideas and figure out if our motives or our reasons for being thinking in a specific way are actually good reasons, or maybe not. Maybe we're just, pissed off because someone else figured something out or is better at something than we are, and our role, our preeminence is taken away from us, like in the case of Merc. So seeing him actually go through that and actively trying to make up is a good thing, I think. I appreciated that bit. Now, we obviously have another really interesting conversation there with Merc and Celeste that goes very deep into philosophy and how perception and awareness or in consciousness maybe are our identity or not. And it's interesting to see that because it kind of mirrors the conversation that Jatal has with that Shadowam, or points to the same questions, what is the self? What is the self, and what happens if it's gone? Can it be gone? Is that death, or is it not? And that's a question that, it's hard to answer. We get different options in these chapters, and I, just found it interesting how different aspects of that are discussed. The other side, however, that I found fascinating there is Merc's you do what feels right for you, because that's the main way to judge anything. The main actually the only measurement should be if you want to do something or not, if you are a moral being. If you think it's the right choice, then you should do that. Which kind of, blows into the actual end of the discussion of everyone's favorite annoying bastard Osirk, who finally realizes that he, now knowing what is going to happen, which is, the stranger coming down, needs to do something, or doesn't. And it's up to him, and it's his choice alone, and he has to live with the consequences, which that sort of existential question has been there in Stonewielder, which makes sense, because Stonewielder takes place roughly at the same time, or at a similar time. It is doing something's better than doing nothing. We had the same question asked in Orb Scepter Throne with Dasem Ultor, when he's when Yusen is talking to her. Yusek, not Yusem. Yusem is the officer here. Yusek is talking to him, is you do what you feel right, and if your choices and your actions are twisted by someone else, that's not your problem. Well, it's your problem, but it's not your fault. So don't think too hard about that. So having that whole conversation shows that Cam Esslemont is wrestling with a few moral questions again and again, and he's exploring them in all kinds of different situations, whether it is, with Stonewielder and the question of our consequence of our actions and inaction, and then again there. It's he does that again and again, and one of them is, as I said, the question of actions, choices, and responsibilities of those. And in this one, it's among other people that has to answer that question. It's Osirk. And the other one is the question of consciousness and identity, and that one is obviously explored in this book with Celeste and the Crippled God. And there's an interesting other question that is talked about here a lot. Other. That is exactly the question of othering and the question of what makes the other and how we deal with the other. And it's obviously the big theme in this one. It has, popped up in earlier Esslemont novels as well, and it will certainly also come up again in Assail. But in this one is obviously very strong. We have the inhabitants of Imhatan that are kind of pushed there because they are other and are thus pushed out, sent out, othered by, their families, whether it is the slightly deformed people out there in Imhatan, whether it is those older creations, those older creatures, those primordial beings that are sent there or live there, the all kinds of shapeshifters and whatnot. But it's, the question of others and the other is once again also dealt with in this book, especially with in form of the Crippled God and Celeste and, her consciousness, whether consciousness is the same as identity or not, which is, as I said, like a huge philosophical question. And then also the fact that the Crippled God, as a pure being, was pushed into this universe. And the Crippled God, by definition, is other, because the Crippled God comes from another universe in some form. And has always remained other. And the interesting thing that we see here is that on the one hand, the Crippled God, by showing up, has tainted, deformed all kinds of creatures, right? We have those crab and lobster people that Skinner and gang are slaughtering. But we also have, the people in Imhatan that were apparently, or maybe the result of what happened when the first stranger, which is, the Crippled God, was pulled and drawn down by the Thamaturgs, has deformed those people. But on the other hand, what we learn through Celeste is that the Crippled God in this world, by being shattered and no longer in full possession of his or their whatever strength and identity, has also been tainted and turned to evil and dark things and whatnot through his contact with the Malazan world. So the whole idea of taint in this regard goes into both directions. This is an important aspect because there is always exchange between entities, cultures, people, whatever. You cannot actually segregate yourself perfectly from the other. I mean, that's sort of what identity means. It's like you build another and a self, but there's always some form of contact between those two, some form of exchange between those two, and it goes both ways. So what is so easy to do with the Crippled God is seeing him as a stranger, as alien, and so forth, with no contact or no communication possible, no positive exchange possible, is wrong. And we know that when we read the end of the Crippled God and the end of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and he's impressed by all the stuff and decides to write that book. We see it here in that one shard that is Celeste interacting with first Merc and then deciding to meld whatever, join our data. That's also exchange. That's positive exchange. And it's so easy to see the Crippled God as just evil, and both Stephen Erickson and Cam Esslemont do a wonderful job of slowly dissolving that so easy preconception of that alien thing being evil, all evil. It's not. So those are some of the important themes that come back again and again in both authors' writings, and a lot of that happens in these 3 chapters that I was talking about today. So let's have a few final thoughts and then we'll leave it for today, I think. One long discussion that I feel is interesting is the whole scene with Cyan and the wizard or non-wizard in that village. Because a lot of things happen there, Hanu brings her there because she's almost dying and fever and whatnot, and we come to that situation which is almost like a subversion or whatever of your typical cult sect colony somewhere, whether it's your Jonestown or Colonia Dignidad or whatever you want to have. Those ideas of like having a kind of the leader of a sect, of a cult, enslaving or whatever you want to call it, a group of believers for whatever reasons, through the pretense of having magical powers, I guess. And well, yeah, doesn't work like that in this case. Because Cyan kind of takes it apart, but it's at the same time it also shows a lot of stuff about society. I mean, what it shows us is exactly the classical theme of him being a guy and having all these women work for him who he has like subjugated through fear and the pretense of powers, and then he claims all their services or all their all their achievements as his own when he goes and claims that he obviously healed Cyan, which in fact he didn't, because it was his wives that did that. So that, I feel, is an interesting thing to look at in that regard. And Cyan breaks that up, breaks that apart, and that once again shows us how the Malazan world in general, both Cam Esslemont and Stephen Erickson, are very much about dismantling these structures, these terrible structures of, the patriarchy and, cult groups and whatnot. That's sort of something that we see here happening a lot, and as I said, I appreciate that, and we'll see where this will be going, because we've got like 2 chapters left, which we'll talk about tomorrow, and we'll see. We'll talk about the rest of the whole thing tomorrow. The 2 chapters, then the epilogue. We'll see what happens in those 3 bits and how this whole thing will be brought together. All right. Once again, thank you for watching all of this. I'm glad I'm back. I got more stuff happening in the next couple of days. So once again, thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, do the good things, and I'll see you tomorrow. Until then, cheers.